since the beginning of time, where things failed. They destroyed their soil. They just, they worked their soil to death, and if you don't have soil, you're not going to sustain life.
The foundation of all society is good soil and clean water. And if we don't have that, how do we feed a world?
We need to protect the Mississippi River Basin. It affects hundreds and thousands of people throughout the watershed, and so it's not just about what's happening in the water, it's about what's happening on the landscape that ultimately affects the water.
If we want resilient farms and fishable streams, we have to work together.
We need to learn and connect with each other, and we just didn't know how. I'm a trained biologist. Farmers relate to that same biology, but their training is how to grow crops. You take different people and they don't always mesh together, and so this is allowing us to mesh in a way that helps us all come together.
When I came to my first workshop in 2016, I had no idea what a farmer-led group was. But after that, we formed our own group, and we've been continuing to grow and to learn together about new ways to manage water resources in our area.
I keep coming back for the learning and the connections, sharing ideas on how to do conservation differently and working across sectors and across jurisdictions.
When we gather as people who care about land and water to talk about issues that really matter to us, we pretty quickly discover that we're smarter, more innovative, and more resourceful together. By sharing stories and asking really good questions, more becomes possible together than anyone could do alone.
The land and the soil, that's my livelihood. My children and grandchildren are going to be on this land when I'm gone. I want it to be just as good for them as it was for me when I got it.
And welcome to Boots on the Ground with Fishers and Farmers. I'm Nancy North, Fishers and Farmers Communications and Outreach Lead and your host today, here today with my colleague, Amy Smith. We're welcoming Kevin Keuhner and Ron Miners with Root River Field to Stream Partnership today. This Boots on the Ground conversation series is a program of Fishers and Farmers Partnership for the Upper Mississippi River Basin. We're a national fish habitat partnership with a goal of respectfully connecting farmers, landowners, scientists, and all collaborators to listen and learn from each other and work together for farms, streams, and fish. In addition to Boots on the Ground, Fishers and Farmers funds local projects, hosts workshops. We cultivate a network to share knowledge for farm and watershed goal achievement across the Upper Mississippi River Basin. And we co-produce Fishers and Farmers Neighbor to Neighbor, a live streamed and on-air program that airs the third Saturday of every month at 9:05. Also available as a podcast at fishersandfarmers.org. Today we are starting with a short video look at the Root River Watershed, the Root River Field to Stream Partnership, and the 3 sub-watersheds that are the focus of this work. This video will also give you a chance to hear from landowners who can't be with us today. After the video, we'll move right into a conversation with Ron and Kevin, and then to 10-minute breakout groups where you can talk about what you've heard. After we've had a really short breakout sharing with the whole group, then we'll move to the open Q&A. We understand that some of you may not be able to stay the whole time, but we hope you can. The whole program has been valuable, and that last half hour can be really rich. So let's move right into the video.
Our goal is to have a farm that's viable 25 years from now. We got to save the dirt. We got to have clean water. It all plays into that.
Water quality, we feel, is very important. We're just trying to make the land better now than it was when we got it.
Like I say, it's just really nice to come out here after a hard rain and see that there's no damage. Not seeing a whole bunch of gullies and dirt going down the river, and it's not only benefiting me, but benefits the people down below.
I'm Kevin Keuhner with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. I'm a soil scientist. Since 2009, I've been working on the Root River Field to Stream Partnership. The purpose of the project is to produce a better understanding of how agricultural practices affect water quality. Starting in 2009, we installed equipment in the streams. Within the watershed, we also picked 1 or 2 locations where we're actually measuring field runoff from actual fields. Really, the first 6 years with this project is to get a science-based information on how much runoff is happening and when it's happening. And the second phase of the project is to work with producers to install additional practices to see what effect it may have on the water quality. One of the key findings that we learned during the first 7 years of the study is that on average about 7% of the precipitation that fell on the monitored fields ran off the surface. And this amount varied by site and by year, and in a dry year we found less than 1%, and in a wet year we found nearly 25% run off the field surface. So how we manage this runoff, can have a big impact on the water quality of a receiving stream or river. The data also showed that our fields are really most susceptible to loss in May and June, and what we found was that about 80% of the annual soil loss and over 60% of the nutrients attached to that soil occurred in those 2 months. And in most cases, it was a relatively small area of the field that was responsible for most of this loss. So targeting these critical source areas at the right place and at the right time, and also making sure that our existing conservation practices are working properly, were really key pieces of information that were used by the partnership to help guide the approach used during the field walkovers.
I'm Ron Miners. I'm a private contractor, and I was asked to come in and help with the walkover process on the Field to Stream Partnership project. A project like this needed to start with conversations with the landowners to get started. And once we had that behind us, we physically walked the tracts of land trying to identify resource needs. We wanted to know if they would be willing to address the highest priority site that we saw on the farm. We didn't want to overburden them with a whole bunch of work. We wanted to make it simple for them. Landowner participation rate in the field walkovers was an incredible 98%. And within just 2 years, over 60% of those cooperators had already addressed or are in the process of fixing their high priority areas on their farms. We still have more work to do, but that speaks volumes about the farmers' commitment to help improve water quality in these study watersheds. And we are very thankful to those cooperators. What I also learned from doing the field walkovers is that farmers already have a lot of practices in place, and most are in really good condition, but about a third of those practices, especially the grass waterways, were not functioning properly and needed additional maintenance.
The waterways require maintenance, obviously, as they're doing their job and catching sediment and the silting. They need reshape every 10 years is probably not a average number, but as you go from farm to farm, it varies on what kind of tillage they're doing. If they're doing no-till and that type of thing, that's a huge impact on life of the waterway and our life of the structures and the sediment that they have to collect.
My name is Josh. Steph and I farm here together with my parents, Joyce and Jerry, and we have 150 milk cows, and we farm 420 acres of cropland. When Kevin and Ron came out and to talk about doing the walkovers, I was open to it. I mean, I think it helps to have a different set of eyes to look at the practices that we have been doing. And I think after Ron did the walkover, we had discussed the high priority areas, agreed that the manure pit that we had, which was a 20,000 gallon manure pit, which would fill up in 5 days, was something that would really need to be replaced. When that 20,000 gallon pit would fill up in 5 days, we would have to just load up, and whether the conditions were right or anything, we would have to go and apply that manure. So the project that we're putting in, it's a 1.9 million gallon all concrete manure storage with a ramp to drive down into the pit to help with the sand. With the way our numbers are right now, it's something that we can just empty in the fall and get all of our manure applied in the fall, and we can get it incorporated right away and be able to utilize the manure for fertilizer as opposed to almost treating it like a waste.
Dave Metzink, we farm here with my son and my wife and daughter-in-law in Caramona Township. We raise corn, soybeans, oats, hay, and from a livestock standpoint, we raise hogs. I have a 90-cow beef herd. Ron came out and described the project, and waterways were, on these two farms we had, waterways were the vehicle to use for the conservation to do our part. We liked the looks of it, and we liked the way it all turned out. And one thing that you don't think about when you put in a waterway, it gives us a natural contour line to start our corn planting. So we actually farm the farm a lot better now than we did before that waterway was there, from a row crop standpoint. And it's a fine line. We want to be environmentally correct, but we have to be economically correct too. I know that there's water monitoring down in the creek, and so it'll be interesting to see and look at the data over the years to see how much have we improved that water quality.
It excites me when landowners can come together as a group and talk amongst each others and see the benefits from a project like this.
I think this project has really helped elevate the conversation in terms of conservation and farming. Without having good science-based information, it's difficult to have a good conversation about water quality and ag practices. And so as producers put more practices on the ground, it provides, I think, another opportunity to showcase the benefits of those practices.
Our goal is to make it better than when we found it and leave the land for the next generation.
Oh, I'd like to introduce Kevin. Kevin grew up in Northeast Iowa. He is a soil scientist, an agronomist, certified crop advisor, and works with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. Kevin's been focused on soil, water, and stream issues in rural watersheds for more than 20 years. He did some really innovative work in Minnesota's 7 Mile Creek watershed, and he designed, launched, and has led the Root River Field to Stream Partnership since it started in 2009. Kevin is still, I live in the watershed where Kevin works, and he is still patiently advancing that work and making the most of every fact, relationship, and outcome that they've created. And Ron Miners. Ron Miners lives and farms in Northeast Iowa. He started with Houston County SWCD as a conservation technician in 1989, and he retired from there as district manager 7 years ago. In recent years, Ron has managed field walkovers for Root River Field to Stream Partnership and helped facilitate implementation of practices that came up during those walkovers. Ron is really generous about mentoring, and he takes a lot of pride in his work. So welcome, Ron and Kevin. So glad to see you today. Before I ask the first question too, I want to give just a little context and just say that all of these projects we're featuring have strong farmer participation and leadership. But I think it's important to say one more time that every local watershed initiative is really different. And if you look back at our featured group in November, the Blackhawk Creek Soil and Water Coalition, their work started when one landowner just loved the creek where he had grown up and decided that he had to do something, and he just started talking to people. So it was truly just someone deciding this is going to happen on his own, and then going around to gather people together. Then last month we had the Rice Creek group and Cannon River Watershed Partnership, and there were all kinds of things going on over time that came together when the time was right. I mean, they were somewhat separate, and then all of a sudden a catalyst brought them together and increased the momentum. And in this case, with Root River Field to Stream Partnership, it is a very deliberate project that had very clear scientific goals from the beginning, is very data driven, and was very deliberately planned and funded to evaluate some things and then move into outcomes. So all of these approaches are real, valid, require, and all come out of different social situations and so forth. So today, this is your chance to really listen in for actions that built and sustained shared work over a long time. And really think about, as you listen, think about how did the investment of time and people in this project play out in the field walkover stage in phase 2 of the work. You will have a chance to ask questions. This is your day. Jot them down so you don't forget. You can also put them in the chat, and we will look at those later in the Q&A. So let's have a conversation here. Kevin, clearly you strategically designed this project and planned the science really carefully. But when you set out to make it happen, how did you plan for connecting with landowners and establishing the connections with people that you needed and wanted to have to drive the work?
So, well, yeah, thank you. And it's good to see some familiar faces out there. But I appreciate the introduction, and thanks for inviting us, Nancy. Hopefully this will be helpful for those of you sitting in, and hopefully you'll pick up some ideas. But as Nancy said, you know, I think every watershed and every project is unique, and so you know, certainly some of the things we have here, hopefully at least part of them could apply to your special situation. But I guess getting to your question, Nancy, I think, you know, kind of going back about 12 years ago, you know, the reason why kind of all this started to begin with was, you know, as I start to engage farmers and landowners on some of these water quality issues, whether it be nitrogen in groundwater or, you know, sediment or turbidity in area streams, you know, there's really good questions that come out of those conversations, right? And a lot of times we don't have all those answers in terms of what the causes are or all the specifics, but that was really kind of the heart of why this project started, was to try to, you know, get a better handle on understanding how different practices, especially agricultural practices in southeast Minnesota, affect the water quality. And I remember distinctly coming back from a car ride. I was coming back from a meeting. It was a total maximum daily load meeting. It was about on Lake Pepin, which is kind of a backwater area to the Mississippi. And there were a lot of questions from participants in that meeting about the causes and effects of various issues related to that TMDL. And one of my coworkers at the time, Adam Burr, and I were driving back in the car, and we both said, wouldn't it be great if we could just help answer some of those questions, or at least get closer to answering those? And really the only way to do that is to pick some small watersheds and really monitor them as best as we can, and be very intentional in terms of how we set up that project. So that was going back to 2008 or so. And so probably in the summer of 2009, we were fortunate to leverage some funding from some of our partners, one of them being Nature Conservancy, another one being some private foundation money through various organizations And that kind of got the ball rolling in terms of doing the monitoring. But before we kind of got involved with that, it was really important for us to get some feedback from some farmers in the area about this idea of really targeting and focusing on some small watersheds within the Root River Watershed. And I worked with Jerry Tesmer, who was the extension agent at the time with the University of Minnesota. Unfortunately, he passed away here about 4 or 5 years ago, but I had the opportunity, Jerry and I had the opportunity to go out and just visit with some farmers and talk about this idea of installing monitoring equipment on fields to measure actually how much runoff is coming off of these fields, and just get a better understanding of runoff and when it's happening, and how much is actually contained in terms of sediment and nutrient loss off of real working farms in these watersheds. So it started with just asking these farmers, what do you think about this idea? And you're never quite sure what kind of response you're going to get, especially me coming from Minnesota Department of Agriculture, being a regulatory agency. What are you going to do with the data? How are you going to use the data? Is it going to be used for additional potential regulation? There's all those concerns that may be out there with collecting this type of data. But, what was really rewarding to me is every conversation that we had with these farmers, these potential farmers in these watersheds, was that they were just genuinely curious and genuinely interested in knowing the answers to some of these questions. And as one of our farmers, I think, put it really well, was just, if there's runoff occurring off of my farm, I want to be the first to know about it, and I also want to know what I can do about it. And so there's just that general curiosity, I think, of knowing more about that. And so that's kind of how we kind of got started with the conversation. And then from that, we identified some potential locations where we could do this edge of field monitoring, and some potential watersheds that were conducive for this type of very intensive type of monitoring.
Kevin, you might say just a little bit about why you chose 3 different sub-watersheds at one time, just a little bit.
Yeah. So the watershed we're working in is located in southeast Minnesota. It's about a little over 1 million acres in size. The Root River Watershed is one of 80 major watersheds or so in the state. It's probably one of the most complex watersheds just because of, number one, the amount of rainfall that we get. We receive the most rainfall in the state, a little over 36 inches or 37 inches on annual. That combined with the unique geology that we have in the area, where the middle and the eastern part of the watershed is characterized as karst, or basically thin soils over fractured bedrock. And then we have, to the far western part of the watershed, we have glacial till soils, so very heavy clay loam soils that require tile drainage. So it's kind of a unique watershed in that we've got this unique combination of both very rapid drainage through karst, but also very poorly drained soils to the west that require tile drainage. And so it's complex that way, but it's also, we also have pretty diversity of practices in terms of farming, ranging from dairy farms to hog farms to just straight row cropping farms. So the idea was, we know that just selecting 1 or 2 watersheds within the watershed may not represent the diversity and the complexity of the watershed. So we were strategic in selecting small watersheds that represented each of those unique landscapes. So the glacial till to the west, the karst in the middle, and then to the far east as they get towards the Mississippi, the bluffland karst. And so these small watersheds represent less than 1% of the land area of the entire Root River watershed. And so, but by strategically selecting these small watersheds, our hope is that these data would be representative to much of the Root River watershed, and not only that, but also much of southeast Minnesota, and especially when it comes to to the way groundwater moves in these systems really could be applied to much of what we call the driftless region or the driftless area of the upper Midwest. So that was kind of our hope by selecting these small watersheds, that it could be applied to a much broader geographic area, even though they're very very small.
Mm-hmm. I have like 100 questions for you, but I'm also watching the time. But before we move on and really dig into the field walkovers with Ron, Kevin, once you kind of tested the waters with farmers to see what they thought of the idea, and then identified these places and really solidified your strategy, how did you approach people to participate? Did you go to, what did you do?
Yeah, so kind of the first step was to identify, potential locations for the edge of field monitoring. And so that was pretty much an objective type of an approach, because when we do edge of field monitoring, we can only, there's only certain types of conditions or fields that we can do that type of monitoring on. But we basically, it was really sort of a cold approach, I guess, so to speak, but sort of just identifying potential locations and then identifying some potential sites that we could do this work on. And, every site that we identified, every landowner was interested in doing the work, but we could only do so many sites in terms of monitoring them. And so we selected 4 edge of field sites, one within each of those small watersheds. We actually have 2 in this karst watershed, but that was kind of the initial step, is getting the edge of field monitoring going. And then kind of the second part was I met individually with each landowner within those study watersheds. And again, these watersheds are less than 5,000 acres in size, so these are very small. But even though they're small, there's about 50 or so farmers within these small watersheds. And so one of the things that I did was I visited with each farmer, kind of explained to them what we're trying to do with the study, and also collected some baseline information from them in terms of what their farming practices were with regard to tillage, nutrient management, and manure management practices. And that kind of served as a baseline, but it also served as an opportunity, of course, obviously, to make that connection with each of the landowners, explaining to them what this project was all about, and really just listening to them about what they want to see as a part of this project and why they're participating in it, and just make sure that that their concerns or their questions were addressed, and that like I said, I pretty much listened the whole time during that meeting. And some of the farmers, interestingly, may have had a bad experience in the past, maybe with their soil and water office or maybe some other regulatory agency. And so a lot of it is just listening to some of their concerns, and of course their perspectives on this issue regarding agriculture and some of the water quality concerns that are located within these watersheds.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a lot of just listening and introducing myself, and that kind of took place probably the first probably 5 years. And we had several small field days where we invited farmers to participate and kind of learn in terms of at some of these edge of field sites, learn what we were measuring and share what we were learning. And that was kind of a buildup, I would say, to kind of building up to Ron's work in the eventual what we call phase 2, which is kind of targeted practices, additional targeting of conservation practices within those small watersheds.
Mm-hmm. So did you gather people together outside those field days? Did you communicate by mail? Did you gather them together? Were there other ways you kept them posted or engaged so they continued?
You know, since these watersheds were relatively small, like I said, you know, we're dealing with about 50 farmers, was that what I found that worked the best in our situation was more small, intimate groups of farmers of probably between around 5 to 10. You know, we tried initially to have kind of a large format or a large meeting, but because of the geographic and the spatial distribution of these watersheds, it's about 80 miles, you know, as a crow flies between each of these watersheds. So there's quite diversity in terms of farming. And so we felt it was better to just kind of keep small and kind of have more of these small, intimate types of groups of meetings with these farmers. And field days, of course, were best to do that with. And of course, one-on-one meetings seem to work really well. We found it challenging to get everyone together. And it almost felt like, too, that the farmers felt reluctant in kind of sharing, you know, their thoughts or ideas when we got the group, you know, too big. And so it just seemed to work better to have these smaller, you know, groups of no more than about 5 to 10 people. You know, certainly that takes more time to do that. But in the end, I think it was, for our situation at least, it was more effective that way.
Mm-hmm. So that first phase was, did you say about 5 years before the field walkovers?
Yeah, yep. I would say that was kind of very informal, just kind of that type of an approach. It was also kind of establishing relationships with the crop retailers that serve with those farmers, because, you know, obviously, you know, a lot of these farmers require advice and guidance from other consultants as well. And so, you know, having a connection with those advisors was really important. So establishing some relationships with them. We did that through on-farm nitrogen rate and timing trials is primarily kind of how we established some of that work. And then, you know, as we got into phase 2, which was, you know, to try to implement some additional targeted practices, we started to kind of explore this idea of trying to leverage the various technologies that are out there to identify what we call critical source areas. And this is something that our data really highlighted, at least the first, you know, 5 or 6 years. And it's this concept that there's this sort of disproportionate amount of loss from relatively small areas of the landscape, either on a field or within a watershed. And one of our edge of field sites really highlighted this. It's what we call Field 4, which is in our Bluffland watershed. And we had this unique situation where the farmer had an existing grass waterway. And after about the first 3 or 4 years of monitoring, we actually didn't have any runoff or very little runoff off of that field. But after about year 4, we had an ephemeral gully that formed on the outside edge of that grass waterway. And it basically just acted like a conveyor belt with regard to soil loss off of that particular field. And it so provided us kind of a unique opportunity to actually quantify and measure that. And over the course of another 3 or 4 years, we found that that field was yielding about 3 times more soil loss than what would be considered sustainable, especially from a soil formation standpoint. And so it really highlighted this really important point of, number one, maintaining grass waterways, but also this idea that there's these relatively small areas on the field or in the landscape that can yield a lot of sediment and nutrient loss. And so that kind of combined with, you know, these latest technologies, especially on spatial analysis tools or terrain analysis tools to identify these areas on the landscape that what are called these critical source areas. And so we did a lot of mapping and kind of investigative work in terms of on the computer to identify where those areas were within these small watersheds. That combined with this idea of, okay, now that we identified these areas, we have the science and the data that supports why we need to kind of target these areas. You know, how do we go about that? How do we, you know, it's easy to identify the areas, but how do we engage these landowners and farmers in a way that they feel comfortable with, but also that we can get the level of adoption that we need to actually measure, some of these changes at the watershed scale, which is, of course, a really challenging thing to do, especially when we talk about watershed management, to get the level of density and intensity of practices that are needed to see a response or a signal in the water quality data. And so we spent about 2 years just kind of talking about what approach is going to be best. Having these small group meetings with farmers to say, hey, if we did, kind of reach out to additional farmers in these watershed, what approach do you feel most comfortable with? And, listening to them. And also around the same time, we've been working with folks in Wisconsin, with Wisconsin Discovery Farms. And it was kind of a sister project called the Jersey Valley Watershed Project. And they were exploring this idea of this field walkover approach, which really is really no different than the days of conservation planning, back in the 1980s with the Farm Bill, but kind of a different twist to it in terms of trying to simplify it and being kind of trying to also leverage the power of some of these spatial analysis or terrain analysis tools that we now have available today. And so through those conversations, we wanted to try to kind of emulate that process in these small watersheds. And around that same time, I had sort of gotten wind that Ron was looking at retiring. And so you kind of got to think about, well, who could do these walkovers? And really, like I said, a walkover is kind of a visual assessment of erosion and erosion potential on these fields. But it takes, a special person that's got the right combination of skills that understands the technical side, but also, of course, has that people side or that personality that can mix really well with a diversity of farmers that we have in these watersheds. And so I kind of got wind that Ron was retiring, and so I kind of planted the seed with him, saying, Ron, if you're ever thinking about doing some part-time work, I have just the job for you. It's called the field walkover. And so lo and behold, we were able to get some funding, and we were able to kind of make that process work. But it took about 2 years of kind of planning and kind of getting all these steps laid in place before Ron actually did any sort of set foot on any of these farms.
Wow, thanks, Kevin. So Ron, let's turn to you and hear about the field walkovers. Can you just start by telling us how you organize? Kevin gave a little hint at what they are, but maybe just briefly describe what you set out to do and how you organized yourself.
Well, Kevin kind of shared the uniqueness of this program, and being in the soil and water conservation business for 25 years, it was quite a change of the way we used to do business. I mean, we typically waited for landowners to contact the agencies, to come into the soil and water conservation offices and request assistance. And here we kind of reversed the role. We were going out, we were targeting these watersheds and targeting these landowners and reaching out to them and asking them if they would be interested in putting some more conservation on the land. So it was the start of the whole project was contacting the landowners and visiting with a few of them, especially our farm leaders in each watershed, and asked them if they would be kind of like the guinea pig or the pilot run or whatever, to be able to try this concept out on their farm, then report back to them with our findings and what we were mapping and everything, and sit down with them and talk things over. So, which we did. We picked on our farm leaders, and I walked 2 or 3 farms, and we met with those leaders, and I had my maps all laid out and feeling good about things, and I had lines drawn all over it. And we soon found out that it was too much. We were offering too much to the landowner. It was too much red ink. we needed to keep it simple. We needed to adjust a little bit, and that was some really good discussions with our leaders. And from there, we revamped things, changed things, kept things simpler. We kept the information that we found on those field walkovers on file with us, so that we could refer back to them later. But we did not share everything that we had found with the landowners. We just looked at the priority areas and highlighted those, and we wanted to offer something to the landowners that just didn't seem overwhelming, that we could get on their land, possibly put in 1 or 2 practices and keep it simple. Mm-hmm. And that process worked out very well, because we found out that once we got there and we were visiting with the landowners and talking about their needs, more things would surface. They would say, well, yeah, and I'm having trouble over here and maybe a little something over there. And heck, now that I've got the bulldozer coming in or the operators coming in, let's fix that up too. And so one thing led to the next. It ended up being just a very successful venture. I guess the one thing that I don't want to miss this before we close today, though, that when we felt that when we went to the landowners and laid this stuff out, and we finally got the landowners to commit to doing a project, we needed to be able to deliver. And so it was maybe a little too easy to go out there and identify all these sites and get the landowner interested and get them ready to go. And that was just part of the puzzle. We needed to be able to follow up and get that practice on the ground. And we found out later on down the road that too was going to be a bit of a struggle, because workloads are heavy for a lot of these offices. And we were offering a lot of things out to those landowners that we're having a hard time delivering.
So how did you work through that?
Push and shove, and our partners came through for us. They really did. Even though the workload was high, they seen the need there for those practices, and it took us a couple of years to get a lot of that stuff on the ground, and the weather helped us out quite a bit. Thank God that when we got started on that, we weren't struck with COVID right off the bat, because these last few months have been very trying to try and finish up some of our work here during this virus situation. But it's a big deal, to have the support and the commitment from all partners when tackling a job like this. Not just the landowners, but all the agencies that will be involved in this. And that can be, like Kevin was talking about, regulatory, on down to technicians and engineers that have the sign-off capabilities and the cost share programs. And there's just a lot of things that go into the mix. And I prided myself when I did this job that I was the kind of the go-to guy that found the answers and worked through all the small details, so that the landowner did not have to do that. So that if he had questions on something, I would get those answers for him. If I didn't have them, if I didn't know for sure what was going on, I would do the behind the scenes work and try to sort through all that stuff, and then come back and offer him some options and some guidance on how to get that done. I think that was a key component, that I was approachable at all times. Even in the evenings, I would give them my personal telephone number, and I said, you can call me anytime, or call me on the weekends if you need to, and we'll keep pushing forward. And so I think they really liked that idea. The trust level between the cooperators, myself, was high. We had confidence in each other, and so I think that was one of the key components. But I can't say enough about the communication and the support of the partners, everybody involved, to get something like this on the ground. When Kevin and I visited earlier, and we've talked about this many times, that this was my only job. This is all I needed to do, was to go out and visit with these landowners, these 50 landowners, and get a connection with them and talk to them. I didn't, because being at the Soil and Water Conservation Office for 25 years, I knew what it was like to come into that office every day and have to deal with many different programs and projects and everything, and I could not give the attention or the time to a watershed project like this. But now, you know, Kevin gave me that flexibility to work with those 50 landowners in those 3 watersheds, and I had a very close connection with all 50 landowners. I even feel a little lost today when, you know, when we're wrapping this thing up. There's some of them that I haven't talked to or seen for several months, and it was good to see the video today, to see Josh Dahl, to see some of those cooperators that we had put huge projects on and spent a lot of hours with, and worked through a lot of details. So it was good to see those people again on the video. And so I was just thankful to be able to do this project. I think it was very unique. It was, to me, was a huge success, the work that we got done, but I contributed that again to being able to do that job and not be distracted by a lot of other things.
That's just super. Thank you, Ron. It's time for us to move to our breakout groups. But I encourage you, if you have questions, to write them down, because you will get a chance to ask Ron and Kevin after the breakout groups. Pretty simple here. Amy's going to divide you into small groups. We try our best to make sure those groups are diverse, so you have people doing different tasks in single groups. The question that we want you to discuss today is, how did the investment of time in people play out at the field walkover stage in phase 2? So how did all the things Kevin described and the time Ron spent move into the success that Ron just described? How did it create that? When you get into the breakout group, you will not be able to see the chat. Amy put the question in the chat. Somebody try to write it down and have it, because you just can't see the chat once you get in the breakout. So it's, how did investment of time in people play out at the field walkover stage in phase 2? To make it easy and fast, Amy is going to quickly read a list of people who, before you break out, who will serve as group leads and do the report back. So if you hear your name called in a minute, you are the person who takes a few notes, and your report back is 1 minute. That's it. We're going to cut you off after 1 minute because we want to leave a lot of time for questions. So also, one of the groups may see Amy pop in to do a photograph or something, so don't be alarmed. All right, Amy, I think we're ready.
Okay, if I call your name, you have been randomly chosen to be the group leader. Group 1, Brent Hoyer. Sorry if I butcher your names. Group 2 is Jenna Hagg. Group 3 is Brad Gordon. Group 4 is Jessica Nelson. And group 5 is Ryan Toot. And like Nancy said, your job is to initiate a really short introduction, initiate conversation, take notes, and then report back to us. I'll give you a 60-second warning when we're ready to wrap up, but enjoy the conversations.
Yeah, I can start. So my name's Haley Summers. I'm a PhD student in the Sustainable Ag program at Iowa State, and I'm studying conservation practices and how they're arranged in the landscape and economics of them. So I'm really interested to just kind of sit back and listen to everybody else talk today.
Hi, Haley. I'm Ron. I think maybe you caught the introduction there in the beginning. So I've been brought on as a private contractor to work with landowners in these project areas and put some conservation practices on the ground. So, you know, just a short story for you, Haley. When I started my career, I ended up starting my career as a volunteer. You know, when farming was kind of rough back in the 80s, I looked for an outside job. And so that got me into the conservation work, and then ended up ending my career as a district manager. So I was pretty proud of that whole stint there. And so it's good to see you young people. It's good to see the young faces into the conservation field.
Warren, it looks like you just joined us. We were doing introductions on kind of who we are in this group?
Yeah, and I was there and heard the introductions.
Okay.
Appreciate that. So my name is Warren Formo. I'm with the Minnesota Agricultural Water Resource Center, and we're a farm organization group that works with farmers throughout the state, and including we've been part of the Field to Stream project since the very beginning. And so a lot of those activities and events and field days that Kevin and Ron have talked about, we were there. And we also administer in Minnesota the Discovery Farms program. So the partnership between Wisconsin and Minnesota and Discovery Farms is also kind of grown into a great relationship with this project as well.
Hi, Warren. It's good to see a familiar face.
Yep, you too, Ron.
So for our task at hand is, I think we can still all see the question in our chat. At least I could, but it's how did this group invest thought and time in people, and how did it play out at the field walkover stage in phase 2? Do people have general thoughts on this question they wanted to share? It sounds like Ron and Warren, you guys are a big part of both of those phases.
Yeah, like Ron, I'd rather I'll gladly chime in, but I'd like to hear what others think who maybe are newer to learning about this project.
I'll just say really quickly, as a PhD student, I do a lot of reading about, the different ways that we can include farmers in conservation practices and what makes them really excited or more likely to have conservation practices on their land. And one of the big things that always seems to come up is having them involved in the process and making sure that no matter what, you have a boots on the ground look. And I do a lot of computer stuff, so I'm not very good at that yet, but a lot of the research talks about the farmers that they really understand and can see it whenever you do things like what Ron's been doing, is doing those walkthroughs. So I think it's really great to see how successful you've been with those walkthroughs and really putting that, putting that research to the test. And that's really awesome.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that it was really encouraging when I did the walkovers to interact with the younger farmers. I'm not trying to pick any one of them out, but they were really engaged. I was really, glad to see that this young generation of farmers wanted to hear what we were offering to them and wanted to do what they could on the land to make things better. They weren't just, are you done with your speech now, and move on. No, these guys engaged and they wanted to make improvements on their land, and that was encouraging.
Typing on the side, so I don't want you guys to hear me tapping, that's why I mute myself. But I think it's impressive how much time you guys invested, and I don't think funders typically appreciate the 5 years of relationship building that you need to do. In the Le Sueur network, it took so long to know who to talk to, how to talk to them, and build up that trust. And a lot of times you have 3 years on a grant, and you spend the first year figuring out what you're doing, and the second year doing it, and the last year oh crap, I gotta wrap things up. So it's nice that you guys had that flexibility. Was the funding, how was it funded, I guess, so you could maintain the relationships?
Most of the funding, Kevin secured all that for my work. He was leading that, but what I was going to say was with the cost share programs and stuff too. We had a couple of years, and they would keep extending some of those things out for us to be able to get those practices on the ground, which was pretty helpful because you're always battling weather and everything. But you're always up against a window there of trying to get things accomplished and wrapping things up. But everybody was very cooperative as far as extending that stuff out.
Okay, Amy, is everyone back?
I believe so.
All right. And you have the names, so let's have the report outs.
I do. We're going to start. Guys, we're running a little bit behind time, so try to keep it short and sweet. Sorry if I had to cut you guys off a little bit earlier when you were in your groups. But first up, group 1 is Brent Hoyer.
And it's hair.
Hair. So. I wasn't even close. My apologies.
Well, that's all right. I had the great to be with Kevin, and I basically congratulated him on the investment of time and people and getting things started out right. It looks like, and the communication with the people. So the video surely really did a good job outlining the project, and it was great just talking to Kevin on how the project went. So I'm here learning about projects, and but time and people are the key, and investing that time right off the bat will pay big dividends. So I'm thankful for that. That's all I have.
Very good. Thank you, Brent. Next up for group 2, Jenna. Give me 1 second. Unmute yourself, Jenna.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Start your video if you want, or you can just talk.
No, I can start my video, that's fine.
Go ahead, floor's yours.
I'm a little dark. But anyway, just to go through everything quick. So in our group, we focused a lot on, talking about how this story was really compelling, and it was really nice to see how well this whole program went and the relationships that were built between the landowners and Ron and Kevin as well. A good point that was brought up was we'd be interested in seeing how much peer-to-peer interaction went on. Like, a farmer that was directly involved with Ron or Kevin, and then how many of those farmers then went and told their peers about what they were involved in and the good things that happened with the program, and to see if any peer farmers had implemented those conservation practices as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Jenna.
Yep.
Next up for group 3 is Brad.
Yeah.
Go for it, Brad.
Thanks. Yep, ready to go. All right, so yeah, we were really impressed by a number of things. So just observing how they spend a lot of time really investing in the relationships, getting to know the landowners, connecting with the trusted neighbors, so the community leaders, the ones that everyone else kind of watches in the community. And then Kevin being a key motivator and bringing everyone together, bringing the funding in and sticking with it. And then Ron being a resident of the watershed, we thought was pretty key, and being able to stick with it as well as a crop consultants project. And then we were just impressed what it led to with 98% compliance for a meeting. So I am going to either call it 2 I need to jump on, but I'm going to leave 2 questions to kind of leave behind for Kevin and Ron. So one was just more information on how you selected those key areas in the sub watersheds, and then 2 were how many visits per landowner did it typically take to lead to any kind of results. So thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Brad. Good questions too. Next up is Jessica.
Hi, we had a pretty good group. Ron was in our group, and Warren and Haley, and we talked a lot about that, how important and kind of undervalued it is to do that relationship building process and the time spent. I think it's important for folks, especially funders, to hear that you can't do all this work in a 3-year grant timeline. It takes 5+ years. And Ron kind of noted that interacting with younger farmers is really inspiring, and they were kind of excited and interested in how to make the farm better, and there wasn't as much pushback from them. So it was kind of nice. And just the importance of the diversity of partners too, I think, to extend funding and field opportunities in the water quality research. Just, yeah, for success.
Awesome. Thanks, Jessica. Last one is Ryan. Go for it, Ryan. You got to unmute yourself.
Yep, I did. Thanks.
Yeah.
Hey, everybody. So I had we had in our group James Stein and Rick Georgeson and Heidi Keuhner and myself. And we talked about things that, other folks have mentioned too, but really the amount of time that it takes to build that trust and work through that process, 5 years reaching out to landowners, and then all the time spent on the field with the landowners, building that trust. And then even once the projects start rolling, you know, having a couple at first to build that trust, to then have that snowball into more projects, I think is really valuable. That was kind of the takeaway from our group. So.
Awesome. All right, that's it, Nancy. Back to you.
All right. Certainly lots of comments here about the value of long-term commitment and the need to communicate that to funders. And it's hard to pull a lot out in the short time you had, but I can tell you were all listening. So I don't want to take any more time summarizing. I'd like to move quickly to the Q&A, realizing some of you may need to leave. The first thing I want to ask is that you all turn on your video and be sure you're in gallery view. And just take a look at the people who are here. I think this is super important. This work is hard. We're all spread out. We don't have as much support as we would like. We're always looking for funding. You know, there are just a million things that make it challenging. If you look at these people, you know these are your peers. You are not alone. And it's okay to reach out to each other here and beyond. And we encourage you to do that because it is what helps us keep going. So thank you all for being here and doing what you're doing. For this Q&A time, we have found, and we'll try it again today, we have found that people are incredibly respectful and thoughtful about how they manage when they speak up. So I'd like you all just to leave your videos on and ask your questions right out to Ron and Kevin. If we just ask them, and if you have a response too, we'll just let it kind of bounce around. Amy, do you have one from the chat that we could start with?
Yes, we actually got quite a few from the chat. The first one is from Monique. She says, great video. How were priority projects identified on each farm? By the field walkover technician or perhaps through modeling?
I can talk to that just a little bit. The mapping that Kevin provided prior to doing the walkovers was extremely valuable. The stream power index maps that the landowners, I mean, it identified the concentrated flow areas and the areas on the farm that were vulnerable to erosion. And even I would use those maps with the landowners, and we'd look at them and they would agree, and I could almost walk right to those areas. And after visiting with the landowners, we targeted those areas, and that's what we concentrated on, and that ended up being just like I say, a very valuable tool. And then listening to landowners too, even though the maps may suggest a certain area on the farm that needed some attention, and we could see that there was some work that needed to be done there. If the landowner had another site that he was struggling with, then that's where we keyed in on, because we wanted to take his concerns on first. So it usually led to coming back to the area we were looking at, but I know that we had a high percentage of the priority areas that were focused on addressed.
I would just add another tool, like Ron mentioned, in addition to the Stream Power Index. We had the opportunity to kind of test out the Ag Conservation Planning Framework tool set that was developed by ARS and Mark Tomer and that crew. And there's a lot of tools that are really interesting, but the one that I thought was most useful for our watersheds was the runoff risk output, which is basically a function of distance to stream and the slope of that field. And very basic, very simple output, but very valuable in terms of just prioritizing and saying, yep, this is the field that has more risk for potential runoff. So that was another tool that we used as well. The other thing I wanted to mention too is with those maps is we were intentional in not sharing those maps with the farmer right away, because we really wanted it to be a learning experience for them and for us, and we didn't want it to seem like we had this stuff figured out before we even set out on their farm. it was really important for us that it was through that conversation first that we developed first, and then if questions came up in terms of why is this area have higher risk than others, then at that point, those maps would come out and we would kind of explain, how this was more of an objective look at your land. And like I was talking with Brent about is, we really try to emphasize this is what Mother Nature gave you, and so we want to, there's challenges with it, and so we want to try to figure out, how can we best minimize that runoff risk.
Yeah, and to add to that, when we would refer to the maps and go to those concentrated flow areas where probably grassed waterways were needed, there were many times the grassed waterway was there. And the landowner was not aware that the thing was not functioning properly, that it was actually creating more trouble than it was doing good. I mean, you would see these green areas on the landscape, and from the road, they looked like everything was being taken care of with those nice grassed waterways. And to get a closer inspection and an actual walkover with the landowner and find out that it's eroding on both sides of that grassed waterway, and they needed to be reconstructed.
There are a few more questions from the chat. This is a two-part question. It says, depending on the practice, what federal funding program do you see works best or is most common to offer farmers a good start for a long-term conservation project? And then two, who manages the grant applications?
Ron, do you want to start with that one?
Well, if you're I think you're talking about cost share programs to get these practices on the ground. Is that correct?
That's what it sounds like.
Yep.
Jack, are you still on? That was a question from you. I don't know.
Yeah, that's mine. It just simply, there's all sorts of programs, all sorts of practices, but what was the most common federally funded program that that worked for your project consistently?
Yep. I would say the ease of the state cost share program would be my first choice when I'm working with landowners on smaller, simpler projects. If we can work them through that program, it just, for me, a lot less signatures, a lot less paperwork, and a lot less time waiting on the landowner's part. However, when we get into some of these project areas where there's extensive work needed, there's many linear feet of waterway and perhaps a feedlot fix and terracing and stuff like that. The capability of the state cost share program is just not there. And so we use the EQIP program, the federal EQIP. And that does take quite a bit of time to work through that. Luckily, we had some good partners again in those three counties that helped us work out through that stuff. And it's hard, I'm not a real patient man when it comes to stuff like that. I don't like the paperwork. I think we maybe lose the landowner's interest along the way and they get a little bit discouraged. But on this project, it worked out. But EQIP was probably the #1 program that we used for most of our work.
Just to add to that, we also had a fair amount of state clean water fund money, and that's managed through our board and water and soil resources. And where we could, we really tried to leverage the state money with the federal money, because obviously that would allow us to do more with that money and expand it out. So as far as the management of the grants, so we primarily used Donna Rasmussen, who was the administrator for the Soil and Water District in Fillmore County. She was primarily the main person that we, her and myself basically wrote the grants for these particular watersheds.
And I did want to throw in there too that Kevin, you've probably got the figures on this, but I just wanted to recognize that there were landowners that did a significant amount of work on their land out there on their own. And so that really spoke volumes to the commitment of those landowners to get that conservation on the ground, to actually do it themselves. And so that was good to see.
Ron, how did you facilitate that? Did you interact with them on that at all or support them?
I did. I told the landowners that I would be more than happy to help the contractor, you know, to help stake out the areas that needed the conservation work, and I would run a grade rod and stuff. I shared with them that I did not have any job class approval authority on any of this stuff, but they weren't getting cost share, so it really wasn't an issue. And there again, we've got contractors in this area, in this watershed, that could do a lot of this work in their sleep. I mean, these guys, they've built waterways all their lives, and so that we are lucky there to have those people available to be able to help the landowners put those practices on the ground.
Okay, got more questions in the chat. What have you seen to be the best native plants for checking the development of ephemeral waterways in CRP or elsewhere?
Can you restate that? Can you say that again?
Yes. What have you seen to be the best native plants for checking the development of ephemeral waterways in CRP or elsewhere?
Well, I guess native plants, I know they've been using switchgrass, they've been using Indian grass, they've been using Cytosgrama, different species. Most of the time when we're working in those concentrated flow areas and we're working through the equipped programs, they've got a seed mixture pretty much put together that they have to use in those concentrated flow areas. The native grasses are slow to come, you know, in those areas like that. So I guess I don't have the mixture right in front of me as far as the native species that are used in there, but you certainly don't want to use, you know, root plants or alfalfa or anything like that. But I know that the NRCS has got, and the state too, they both got a seed mix that they recommend to their landowners.
I'll just keep rattling off questions. If anyone else has one, feel free to chime in. Question from the chat. What kinds of maps did Ron have in hand? Specifically, what kinds of data did he look at before stepping foot on a farm? Aerial imagery, contours, LiDAR, soil types, or others?
I was given most of those. I was given an array of maps, all the above, on the profile of the farm maps, boundaries, stream power index maps. Kevin referred to a bunch of them that we used with the landowners, and there again, it got to be a little bit too much for the landowners to work with. And again, I just can't say enough about that stream power index map, because that thing was just so spot on. It was just crazy how I could go right to those areas on the map, and if it showed a forked waterway with like 5, 6, 7 little arms coming off it, it was spot on. And so I used those maps a lot when I was doing my field work.
I have a question. When looking at, like, was the yield maps a part of your guys's kind of atlas of things to look at, and was that a big driver of maybe this is like a low yielding area, to talk about what conservations to put in and where?
Hey Jessica, no, it wasn't a primary tool that we use. For our edge of field farmers, I did have that information, but one of the things we're looking at right now, actually, as we kind of spin off of the walkovers, is actually prairie strips, right? And trying to integrate prairie strips in strategic locations, especially these headland areas. Typically, not always, but these headland areas, or these turnaround areas with field equipment, tend to be areas where we get more compaction for various reasons. But that tends to result in some lower yielding areas of the farm or the field. And so we are looking at that with this prairie strip initiative to kind of use that as another piece of information to the farmer in terms of making an investment. If we did retire some of that land out of production through CRP, through that prairie strip effort, could that help, boost the overall average yield for their farm? And obviously, having 5 or 6 or more years of yield data will be helpful for that. So we're just getting into that.
Thank you.
This is Rick, and I'm located in western Wisconsin, along the Wisconsin River. During your last 12 years of work, during your project, has soil health ever become, has that risen to the top of? That's big in our part of the state, soil health.
Yeah, I'll be starting, and Ron, if you want to kind of add. Yeah, I would say it is. Soil health is gaining a lot of interest and a lot of momentum. And it all kind of started with minimum tillage or no-till type of operations, and then integration of cover crops. In these particular small watersheds, I've seen farmers, try cover crops to various degrees of success. And I think it's just been a trial and error for a lot of these farmers here lately, what works best for their system. I think for our dairy farmers, integrating cover crops to really boost soil health, I think makes a lot of sense, especially in continuous corn silage type of operations where they can get that cover crop on and seed it on early enough. I think still for our more corn soybean rotation farmers, I think it's still a challenge of how to get that cover crop on and get it to germinate early enough so they can get some of the benefits from it. But it really ties into the no-till as well, and I think that's where farmers are still trying to figure out, how do we get this no-till to work, and then try to figure out how to integrate cover crops into that no-till. I would say it's growing, but it's slow. I think in the whole state of Minnesota, I think we're right around 2% of the acres are typically getting, let's say, a cover crop. So there's a lot of opportunity, but it's slow. I think farmers are certainly innovating that aspect of things, especially with equipment and things like that. And I think what's interesting too is our crop retailers really expressing interest in trying to maybe retrofit their equipment to be able to get some of these cover crop seeds established early enough. So Ron, I don't know if you had any other comments on soil health, but
not too much. I think that I would say the same, that it's coming slow. Rick, we've had these demonstrations where they've got the rainfall machine that shows over the various soil types and everything, and landowners have been very interested in watching that.
Yeah.
The simulator. Yeah. And so especially with the younger farmers, they're interested in the bottom line. They don't want to make any more trips across the field than they need to, and they're seeing the benefits of the no-till systems coming in. But it's slow, but I think it's the future.
This is Ray. Ron, where do you get that stream power index map? That sounds really interesting.
Those were generated, Kevin. I don't know. Did you get those through NRCS, or who generated those maps for you, Kevin?
So we actually generated them ourselves, but now there is, as I mentioned, it's called the Ag Conservation Planning Framework. It's a tool set that's available for people that use GIS, and you can basically install that on your computer, and it allows you to run and generate the stream power index. It it's surprising to me that that is not available, you know, in a Google Maps type of application yet. And I think part of the hesitation that I've seen from various people is that the stream power index is somewhat sensitive to the landscape. So, you know, an index for, let's say, Houston County in Minnesota might be much different for, let's say, an area in south central Wisconsin, for instance. But I think hopefully over time that will become more ubiquitous in its use. In my opinion, again, I think it's one of the most important tools, especially for grass waterways and identifying where grass waterways should be. You know, stream power index is, like we said, it's a very important tool. And but unfortunately, it's not quite, unless other people in the group maybe know this, but at least I'm not aware of, you know, an easy to use application right now where, you know, you can just pull it up and show it up, you know, show it on a map.
You got one more.
This is
sorry.
Jack.
Go
I
ahead,
have
Jack.
a question. So in Minnesota, well, let's step back. Most states and then the counties within those states probably have a water plan, a local water plan. In Minnesota, we've embarked on a thing called the One Watershed, One Plan. So it's in each county and it's separated by watersheds, but it's supposed to be the master plan, the master water plan that brings all municipalities and landowners together to figure out how to manage water. So Kevin, Ron, put you on the spot here. Would you say that Minnesota's One Watershed, One Plan for your counties or watershed has been playing an instrumental part for messaging the practice, or it's just off to the side, maybe parallel to your discussions?
Yeah, good question, Jack. I think, you know, the One Watershed, One Plan really kind of rolled out for the Root River Watershed here about 2 years ago. And I think they're still in the stage of just trying to get through projects that they had on their list. But I think there's going to be more pressure, especially by me, to have them start to think about more of how they can better target their dollars, you know, in these efforts. I think right now they've got probably another 2 years or so or more to get through their list of projects, but they're going to get to a point where, you know, they're probably going to start to need to start doing more proactive work in terms of identifying more conservation projects out there. And so I think hopefully they can take some lessons learned from this effort and, you know, what worked, what didn't work, and hopefully try to, build it into their planning. And it's built into the plan, but, you know, there's one thing of planning versus actually doing, and it takes a lot of effort to make all of those things work.
Amy, did you have another question?
Yeah, it's a question / request. It says, Ron, give examples of too much and also keeping things simpler to get better buy-in. I believe this person's talking about getting the initial buy-in from the farmers to do the walkovers. So what were some examples of, you know, projects that were too much for that farmer to handle at that particular point, and how did you keep things simple to get better buy-in?
You know, that's a good question, because when we did it with our when we ran the kind of the pilot run with one of our farm leaders, I spent a lot of time on that farm, walking that farm, and I wanted to be like a doctor. I didn't want to leave anything untouched. You know, I want to record everything from the smallest amounts of erosion to just everything. And when I came back, I had these pages and pages and pages of stuff wrote down, and I can remember I got labeled as the dirt police. You know, I was being really too objective on all that stuff, and that was good for me to hear too. You know, there was just too much. I would use red ink, you know, that we had erosion here and we had some here and we had some here. So it got to be too much. And you start losing the interest of the landowners when you bombard them with all kinds of information like that. And we found it much more productive to just key in on one or two of the priority areas, and let's talk about that and let's get that fixed, and not worry so much about all the trivial little things. And so it's kind of like the phrase "too many cooks in the kitchen" too. You can overload these landowners with programs and technicians and rules and regulations and everything that goes on, that you start losing them along the way. So we want to keep it simple. We want to offer those landowners something that they would look at, agree with, and move forward with. And we talked about this earlier about keeping this thing to smaller groups of people. And I think someone had commented on that during the program here about seeing things on their neighbors' farms. And that just got everybody thinking about doing something on their own farm. And I think that was a good buy-in. And I started using that as kind of a sales pitch when I went to the next farm and the next farm and the next farm. I would refer back to say, yes, we've been working with your neighbors and we're talking about putting in some stuff over here. And did you see the grassed waterway that we built over here? And did you see some of this stuff going on? And between that and the coffee shop talk and everything, I think landowners, their awareness was just heightened by seeing what's going on in their small neighborhoods, in their communities. And then they felt, yeah, I want to be part of this effort too, and I want to do something. So it got to be easier and easier and easier as we went along to sell these projects.
Okay, it's 2:30. Are there more questions?
Can I comment to the one that the young fella had about how many trips did it take?
Yes.
Per landowner, because that varied so much, and it all depended on the size of the operation and the needs on the farm and everything. But I would say minimum, I would probably contact that landowner or visit with him 8 or 10 times. And on the high end, if we had a big feedlot and we had a lot of stuff going on, it could have been 40 to 50 contacts. It got to be pretty intense, daily checking in with those landowners and seeing how that work was coming along to see if they had any struggles or anything going on. And I would keep in constant touch with them because there was just a lot of things rolling out, but it varied all over the place. I thought I had to keep a log. I kept a log for Kevin on the trips that I made to these landowners, and some of them seemed like a lot, and then some went pretty smooth.
Thank you for saying young feller. That was my question originally. Oh, I'm 85. I'm 85. So.
There you go.
So Ron, a question for you. On this initial conversation with a farmer, did you approach that conversation as if you had a bag of tricks that was going to help him along?
No.
Or did you approach this farmer with, is there anything that maybe I could help you with? Do you have any concerns on your farm? I think approach is so key, and just can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I think it would have been the latter. I didn't want to come in to their place like a know-it-all and a little bit on the arrogant side and everything, and you need to do this and you need to do that. I got that conversation going with them and just wanted to kind of create this fellowship or this partnership with them and talk about their farm a little bit and listen to what they had going on. And you can soon hear kind of the things in the background of maybe they had some struggles with some agencies in prior years, and less government, is the way to go, and I don't need to go through all it. So you can kind of sort some of that stuff out. You listen carefully. You know when to talk, and you know when to listen and be patient with some of these people. Mm-hmm. And there's always personal dynamics in the neighborhood too. There's always people that are competing on land rental things, and there's just all kinds of different things. So I'm not trying to put myself up on any kind of pedestal, but you have to be a little careful and a little delicate when you're working with landowners, and they live it every day. They're making that's their livelihood, and to come in there and think that you know more than they do, not so good.
Well, so then what would inspire a second meeting with that farmer?
Pardon?
What would inspire meeting number 2 with that farmer? Did that farmer call you back? Did you call on him again?
I would call on him again. I would never leave things open-ended. I felt that in most cases, if I was waiting for the landowner to contact me, it likely wasn't going to happen. I left it with them that said, once you think about this, once you take a look at what I've got offered here, and when I get a chance, I'm going to give you a call again, and we'll just visit for a few minutes. I always wanted to make sure that they knew I wasn't coming to spend an hour or an hour and a half or something with them. I just wanted to see if there was anything that we could help them with, and just give them a little space and a little time to think things over. And I usually made sure that because if I left things open-ended, then too many times it got left that way. And so I touched base with them again.
Ron, what you say fits right in with very good advice I got a number of years ago from an international rangeland consultant. And she said, don't go there offering anything, but especially not advice. Go there to visit and listen. And just ask the owner, well, tell me about your operation here and what are your problems? And then keep going back. And don't say anything until they start asking questions.
Correct.
That's what she said.
Yep. Yep. And it was also important to, if I had a chance, I always like to recognize what they had accomplished there on their land too. I'd say, it's nice to see the contour strips, or it's nice to see the grassed waterways, or I see you've done some work down here. How's that working for you and everything? And a lot of times they would say, that thing is too deep. I can't get through it with my tillage tool. That's too steep a side slope, or something's not right. And I said, well, we can fix that. We can do some work in there. And because machinery had changed throughout the years, what worked 30 years ago or 40 years ago, it doesn't necessarily work today. Yeah. And so you see a lot of that going on out there, that they're not happy with some of the work that had been done. And so we corrected some of that. And but you're right. You've got to go on there and you have to be able to listen. And I think I touched on that earlier, that not necessarily the site that we picked out was a site that we fixed. We wanted to see what site they were having trouble with and key in on that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So a little bit more on this landowner contact. The old days you just cold call, you might walk onto the farm. Was there a preferred approach on how you would make that first contact with a landowner in a township? Was it email, I'm coming out, or was it truly a targeted, I'm going to walk on this land and knock on the door first?
We tried a couple of different approaches when we started. We did send some letters out to landowners, and I know Kevin had touched base with them. They knew this was coming. I mean, they knew that the project was going, and that they would be contacted by someone, by me or whatever. Kevin had already let them know that, but I prefer telephone. I still like to talk to people, hear them out, try to find out a day. I said, hey, one day next week, or down the road a little bit, or what might work for you, for me to just touch base. And then I would let them know that when I'm starting to kind of zero in towards their property, I'd give them another call. I'd say, hey, I'm in the neighborhood and I'm going over to visit with so-and-so, and I'd like to stop in and see you for just a few minutes, and it usually worked out well that way through the phone contact for me.
So how were they made aware of this project?
Kevin, you want to?
Yeah, so as far as the field walkovers, when we sort of got to phase 2, which was to implement practices at a bigger scale in these watersheds, what I did is I had our farmer leaders send a letter to their neighbors, mentioning this walkover approach and encouraging, their neighbors to participate. And the reason why I did that is because it just meant more, obviously, coming from them than it would from me. And it also did another thing in terms of just kind of, it was a litmus test to see if our farmer leaders were comfortable, with this next phase of the project. And, if they commented back that, hey, I'm not comfortable sending this letter out, well, that meant that, we needed to do some more effort to before we get to that stage. And so I think that worked really well. It came from them. in one of the watersheds, actually a crop retailer, a really well-respected crop retailer, sent that letter out. I think that was really important to kind of talk about this next phase and introduce Ron, and that's kind of basically how we got the walkover advertised, I guess.
Well, I think we should close. Does anyone have a pressing question you still want to ask?
Quick time. This was advertised, I think, as 9:30 in the morning, but it came on at 1 o'clock. What's the plan for the future?
Oh, thank you. You may have seen we are introducing two programs at one time, and it's been confusing for some people. The radio program we're doing that airs on the third Saturday of each month from Madison and live streams at that time starts at 9:05. That may be what you're thinking about, Ray.
Okay.
This conversation series is the third Thursday of every month at 1 o'clock. So next month, I hope you'll come back. We will be meeting with a group of people from the Pinot Creek Watershed in Northeast Missouri, who have been working together on a cover crop program and expanding across that watershed. I think you'll enjoy hearing from them very much. I thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks for having me, Nancy. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks,
Thank you.
Kevin. Thanks, Ron.